Welcome back to a Physionic video, guys. I'll be honest with you, this video is going to be overwhelming for a lot of people because it is going to be highly biochemistry focused. We are going to be going into the cellular aspects, but even deeper than that, we're going to go into the molecular aspects of alcohol metabolism and bioavailability. So we're first going to create a base foundation, so we're going to understand what alcohol is briefly, and then we're going to go into digestion, absorption, what impacts absorption, and then we're going to go into where it is metabolized. We're going to go into the cell structure just a tiny bit, and then once we're into the cell structure, that's where we'll go into the actual molecular biochemistry and understand how alcohol is metabolized. However, what I can tell you is by the end of this video, you're going to have probably the most comprehensive understanding of alcohol metabolism that you've ever dreamed of having. I've spent several weeks on this article and on this video, and I'm going to edit this video as much as I possibly can to make this as comprehensive and to put this together with as much detail as I can. However, of course, as with most of my scholarly videos, this video is I'm going to have to cut out a few details, and those details will be found in the article that I've uploaded for free for you down below. I also have all my visuals down below in that article, and more importantly, I've got all my sources, all my scientific peer-reviewed sources linked in that article as well if you'd like to check into something with more detail. That said, of course, we also have a menu system linked in the description box so you can skip to different parts of the video. And there is a summary section that I begrudgingly put into this video. Typically these metabolism videos are very difficult to put a summary section in, but I went ahead and tried it anyways, and hopefully that it provides at least some basic overview on everything that we're going to discuss in this video. If you do stay tuned for the entire video, I'm really thankful for you. You're the type of person that I really started this channel for, people that really want to know everything that there is to know. And if you've got more questions, then please feel free to post them below and let's start a dialogue on the topic. That said, this video is already going to be really long, so let's go ahead and get started. But yeah, I'm excited. Let's get to it. Alright, so the first thing, what is alcohol? I think most people would say, well, I already know what alcohol is, but do we really? I guess we felt what alcohol does to our body, but do we really understand what alcohol is? Alcohol is, well, the consumed alcohol, because there are various types of alcohol. I guess if you look at chemistry, you're talking about a hydroxyl group that's added to a molecule, but if you're talking about our consumption of alcohol, we're talking specifically about ethanol. So that is what the discussion, if I at any time interchange between ethanol and the word alcohol, they are one and the same in the context of this video, so just know that I'm talking about the other one. That's all you really need to know, and now we can move on to the next part. Alrighty, so let's say that we've just ingested some alcohol. How does it get through to our metabolic pathways? Because it has to actually reach those metabolic pathways before it can actually be metabolized. And that occurs through digestion and absorption. So how does that occur? We've ingested alcohol, it gets into our stomach. And believe it or not, I was a little surprised by this, but The stomach is actually one of the sites of absorption. Usually the stomach is just a site of digestion, but in this context, it is also a site of absorption. Not only that though, also metabolism actually begins in the stomach, which I also found kind of interesting. It's called first pass metabolism. And I'm not going to go into it too much here because we will kind of go over a little bit more in the actual biochemistry section of this video. But I can say that first pass metabolism is really important when it comes to the level of intoxication that we feel from alcohol. So the effects of alcohol. The higher your first pass metabolism, so the higher activity of that initial metabolism in the stomach, ends up leading to a lowered intoxication. Pretty interesting. So we're able to metabolize faster if we have a more active first pass metabolism. So about 20% of absorption occurs in the stomach. However, then through gastric emptying, then enters the small intestine, and about 80%, the remainder of alcohol, is then consumed or absorbed into the bloodstream through the small intestine. So now we've moved alcohol, we've partly metabolized, a little bit of metabolism occurs in the stomach, and then we've moved it and absorbed it into the intestinal tract as well as the stomach, and now we're in the bloodstream. Got it? All right, let's move on to the next section. Okay, so what impacts absorption, however? I wanted to quick throw in a section on this because it is something that's actually applicable, something that you might be able to change. And I'm not going to cover all of them. More of them are located in the article, as usual, for more details, but I wanted to cover a few of them. So the first thing is body weight. Body weight makes a big difference because our body weight is not just a weight, it's not just some random number, it's also a matter of mass, it's a matter of matter itself. So the amount of fat mass, bone mass, muscle mass, especially that muscle mass, but also hepatic mass, so liver mass. All of those things have an impact on our entire body's function. So the larger that you are, the larger mass that you have, that would mean that the alcohol is more diluted, so you're going to have less of a feeling of alcohol because you've got higher dilution, which means that you've got higher fluid volume, you've got higher mass in general. So that is the first thing that I wanted to quick touch on, and that is going to impact our absorption and metabolism in general. The next one is eating or being in a fasted state. If you're in a fasted state and you consume alcohol, then our gastric emptying is going to be much quicker because we're just trying to dump that alcohol and get it metabolized as quickly as possible. So not only is that going to impact our later metabolism, the main parts of our metabolism, but it's also going to impact our first pass metabolism. The longer that alcohol sits in that stomach, that means that we've got a longer duration for that first pass metabolism to occur. So that said, if you don't eat anything, or if you do, let's say you do eat something and then you consume alcohol, you're going to slow the absorption and increase that first pass metabolism. So you'll feel less of an effect from alcohol because you ate food. You were able to slow down that gastric emptying. So that's the second thing. And the final point that I wanted to touch on in this video is a physiological function. So I don't know if you're familiar with some of the basic biology like passive diffusion or active transport or facilitated diffusion, but alcohol moves typically through passive diffusion. So it moves from a high concentration to a low concentration. So if you consume a lot of alcohol and it's all sitting in your stomach and then it gets released, let's say, into your intestines relatively quickly, then it's going to move from a concentration of high concentration to low concentration. So in your blood, at least initially, or really any time, you're going to have low concentrations of alcohol, and then that alcohol is going to move and diffuse quicker because it's going from a very high concentration because you're feeding alcohol into your intestines, and then that ends up leading to a higher level of intoxication. So some way to mitigate that, of course, is to just take your time consuming alcohol. On the back end, of course, that also allows your body time to metabolize. So you're decreasing that passive diffusion speed, and you're also increasing the amount of time that your body's able to metabolize alcohol. So kind of interesting. And again, there are other factors, but they're all linked down below in the article. Let's move on to the next section. Alright, so alcohol has entered the bloodstream, right? Now, where's it going to go to actually be metabolized? I already kind of mentioned one of them, right? The stomach is part of that first pass metabolism and is going to be the initial site of metabolism. However, it's not the main site of metabolism. The next stop is the liver. I think that's pretty familiar with most people, that the liver does most of the metabolism for the body. So we're talking about 90%, 80 to 90% of alcohol metabolism occurs in the liver. However, you might be a little surprised by the fact that it's not just the liver, it's not just the stomach. It's actually also your brain. Yeah, who would have thought? Your brain and your pancreas also add a small fraction to that metabolism of alcohol. Kind of interesting, isn't it? Alright, so now the big one. We are going to finally move on to the actual biochemistry of how alcohol is metabolized. And I'm going to put in a few of those little tidbits in there to kind of keep things a little lively. Okay, let's move on. So this is the big part. This is going to take up the majority of the video. How is alcohol metabolized? We've put it from stomach, intestines, it's gone into the bloodstream, been delivered, let's say, to the liver, which the majority of metabolism occurs there, in the hepatocytes, which is the cells of the liver, and then in the cytosol is where the primary parts of metabolism occur. So, for us to get a better visual, now I'm going to switch to a blackboard method, and then we can follow along and look at the biochemistry itself. So, let's go ahead and do that, and I will see you on the back end with my actual face. Alright, let's do it. Alright, welcome to the blackboard method. So before we actually get started and go into all of the step-by-step mechanisms, I'd like to first kind of orient ourselves. We know that things for the majority happen in the liver, but let's look at within a cell, within a liver cell, what happens and where it occurs. So there are actually 3 sites, and we're going to go over each one of the biochemistry mechanisms for each one of these 3 sites, but there are 3 sites inside the cell where alcohol is metabolized. The first one is in the cytosol, and I believe I already mentioned this, but it's in the cytosol. The second site is in the endoplasmic reticulum, so cytosol, which is really all this kind of bluish area, the endoplasmic reticulum, which is this kind of funky structure here, and then the last one is in the peroxisome, which is this green blob here. And then once the first step occurs, and we're gonna go over that first step next, but once that first step occurs, then everything gets moved into the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. I'm sure you've heard that plenty of times throughout your middle school and high school biology. So that's just a rough idea of where this stuff occurs, and I'll quick point out at each step which mechanism is taking place and where. Okay, there we have it. Let's move on. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will begin now with the first step of our overall mechanism. So we're going to have 3 steps, and this is our first step, and it is by far our most complicated step. So don't get scared away because you see a lot of craziness, a lot of different diagrams. A lot of this blends together, and I'll explain how. So the first mechanism, and this is the primary mechanism, the primary pathway by which we metabolize alcohol, is through the alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme, which is right here, abbreviated as ADH. It is also located over here. I'm only going to point out certain aspects of this ADH enzyme, but again, that is the alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme. And this enzyme, if you'll remember, I mentioned earlier in the video that we have what's called a first pass metabolism in the stomach, and that is due to the alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme. Interestingly also is that there's a difference between men and women. Women tend to have significantly less I've got the exact percentage in my article, but they have significantly less of this alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme, which would mean that women tend to metabolize alcohol at a much slower rate than men, which might be one of the reasons why people recommend that women consume a little bit less alcohol than men, because it'll affect them, at least in the long term or for a longer period of time. So let's talk about this enzyme and a little bit about the mechanism. So while here it's a little bit blown up, here we're again moving from ethanol, and we're moving into our intermediate molecule, which is acetaldehyde. Now, acetaldehyde is not the greatest molecule. It's not something that you want in your system for long term, because acetaldehyde is what we believe, at least in the scientific community, what we believe causes fatty liver disease. So you know how alcoholics tend to drink a lot of alcohol, so they tend to metabolize a lot of alcohol. That makes sense. So they end up with a decent amount of acetaldehyde throughout their life. And that being the case, that's what is at least one of the big theories as to why, or at least one of the contributors to why we have fatty liver disease, or any sort of liver disease, is due to this acetaldehyde molecule buildup. On another note, it is also possible that our state of drunkenness that we experience as we drink more and more alcohol may be at least partly contributed to by this molecule, acetaldehyde. It is a carcinogenic molecule. It may cause cancer. It does a bunch of destructive things to our body, and it certainly is not something that the body wants to keep in that state for a long time. So alcohol is, however, metabolized in all three of these systems, in all three of these pathways, is metabolized into acetaldehyde. Now, that said, ADH, our main pathway, what does it do? Well, here isn't a perfect description, because technically over here we see that we actually end up losing another hydrogen, but we end up essentially losing this hydrogen and losing another hydrogen here, and ending up with just one here and losing our hydrogen there. And that's what ends up leading to our acetaldehyde molecule. Now, another thing that I wanted to quick mention that I've got again in more detail in the article is that this ADH mechanism actually uses the minerals zinc, and it also uses water. We're not 100% sure how or for what reason, but we do have an idea that it may be possible that zinc and water have kind of an attraction quality to this NAD, which is nicotinic adenine dinucleotide, which is a mouthful to say, but that is actually used in energy production. And I'm not going to bog you down with a whole bunch of information on that, but if you know anything about a citric acid cycle, if you know anything about the electron transport chain, then you know that NAD is a very important molecule. It's a very beneficial molecule. It's something that we absolutely need for our survival. So interestingly, we end up using an NAD and end up reducing that to NADH by adding a hydrogen to it. All right, so now let's move on to the next one, which is actually really interesting. ADH itself is pretty interesting. However, the next one is also very interesting, this pathway, which is called the microsomal ethanol oxidizing system, which is sometimes also generalized as the microsomal oxidizing system, because it's actually involved in many different oxidizing systems. It does many different things. But in this particular instance, we're looking at a particular style or type of oxidizing system around ethanol. Now, this one is located in the smooth ER. I did mention ADH was located in the stomach, and it's also located, obviously, in the liver, and inside those liver cells we're talking about in the cytosol. But when it comes to our MEOS, and that's how I'm going to abbreviate it, MEOS system, we're talking about the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and I did point that out earlier. In terms of how it's activated, it tends to be more active in alcoholics, and that tends to be because people who consume large quantities of alcohol, their ADH system probably can't handle that total volume of alcohol on a repeated basis, so ends up employing this MEOS system, which then we see a growth in that endoplasmic reticulum inside the cell. So we're able to measure the amount of that endoplasmic reticulum, or the quality, or the kinetics, the speed by which the enzyme, and the enzyme that we're actually talking about in this case is NADPH cytochrome P450 oxyreductase. Yes, I know, it's a massive mouthful, and I don't want you to get too confused by the CYP2E1, which is actually just an isoform of that P450, and that's what I'm going to abbreviate it as, P450. Now, before I get to the next kind of cool, interesting fact, let's go over some of that biochemistry. So here we see, and this is really all we need to focus on, just this area right here, we see instead of just an NAD, we use a phosphate that's attached to an NAD molecule, and then we end up using that oxyreductase system, and on the other end we end up coming up with water, which is kind of interesting. So we end up giving up one of those hydrogens, and then we end up with water, and of course on the back end we also end up with acetaldehyde. Now, that phosphate that's attached to that NAD, though, is really interesting, and I believe, and I've just seen a little bit of just a few resources kind of talk about this, but it's possible that alcoholics actually have a higher resting energy state, resting energy expenditure, because they have to phosphorylate this NAD molecule. So while an NAD molecule would look like this, well, in this case, this NAD molecule has a phosphate attached to it, and that phosphate actually comes from an ATP, or could come from a high energy molecule. So that being the case, that would mean that we would need more ATP to phosphorylate the NADPH to then go through this system. So again, if the MEOS system is elevated and more active in alcoholics, and that MEOS system uses NADP, then that means that we would need more energy to metabolize alcohol, which would again increase our resting energy expenditure. Kind of cool. I thought I would throw that in there. Now, for this system, we need a heme iron as well, and then again, like I mentioned, we end up creating acetaldehyde and H2O. And finally, I want to talk about our third system, which is our least active system, but I would argue that it's probably, to me, I think it's probably one of our most interesting systems when it comes to the metabolism of alcohol, and that is our catalase enzyme system. So the catalase system is found in those peroxisomes that I pointed out earlier. And with this system, actually, is really just one thing that I just found really interesting, and that's this H2O2. If you're familiar with chemistry or biochemistry, you might recognize that as hydrogen peroxide, which is a ROS, so a reactive oxygen species. And the reason why that's interesting is because a reactive oxygen species tends to be attributed to cancer causing or harming or being kind of a cellular weapon, however you want to end up interpreting that, because ROS isn't completely bad. It can be used for good as well, but typically it's considered a radical, or it's something that's cancer causing. So this enzyme catalase, and it does many more things than just ethanol to acetaldehyde, but this enzyme actually takes a hydrogen peroxide and an ethanol, so two molecules that would be considered bad, quote unquote bad, and creates water out of it. That's just a brilliant mechanism that our body has to use hydrogen peroxide and ethanol to create water. Now, of course, just like with the other two mechanisms, we also end up with acetaldehyde, and that's what we'll cover in the next step. What does our body do with this molecule that is also equally as destructive as anything else and causes so many harmful effects to our body? Alrighty, so moving on to our step 2. Here, obviously, you can tell that this is much simpler. I will say that this is the beginning of where we start things in the mitochondria. So while all three of those other steps took place in different areas of the cell, this typically occurs in the mitochondria. I will say also that some of this can occur in the cytosol, but the majority occurs in that, again, quote, powerhouse of the cell, unquote. So in the mitochondria, we have an enzyme by the name of aldehyde dehydrogenase, and as we know, acetaldehyde does do damage, so it may cause some level of drunkenness and also actually causes liver damage, which is far more severe, and has an impact on our overall body. So we can't have it in our system for very long, so that's where this aldehyde dehydrogenase comes in and ends up using another one of those NAD molecules and shuttles off a hydrogen. And here we see again this loss of a hydrogen, and here it's gone. Now, of course, we also end up adding an alcohol group along the process, but it's really pretty self-explanatory, just moving acetaldehyde to acetic acid or acetate. And from here, then we can move on to the step 3. So all 3 of our previous steps lead to this step, and then we can move on to our step 3, which has some really interesting components to it as well, which we'll learn about now. All right, in our final step, what do we do with acetate? So I put up 2 diagrams here. They are actually the same thing. I don't know if you're able to recognize that immediately or not, but there is a slight distinction, and that's why I added 2 so that I could get a full picture for you guys. So here we are with acetate. Acetate is at the top of our citric acid cycle. That's what we're looking at here. TCA cycle, it's called the Krebs cycle, citric acid cycle, whatever you want to call it. This is it, and it's found in the mitochondria. If you're familiar with aerobic metabolism or metabolism in general, then you'll know that the TCA cycle tends to occur in the mitochondria. So here we are with our acetate, and this is actually where things get a little interesting, because to synthesize what we need for the citric acid cycle, we need acetate, and we need an enzyme by the name of acetyl coenzyme A synthetase. Now this enzyme, however, when it creates acetyl-CoA, which is right here and is actually our main product that we need, or our substrate that we need for the citric acid cycle to occur, for that to happen, we need ATP. So we use ATP, and that's why I've got this diagram here, because it doesn't show it here. We use ATP on acetate to then eventually create acetyl-CoA. So, believe it or not, this ethanol that we first started out with is now in acetate and is now a contributor to the energy cycle of the TCA cycle, which doesn't actually create much energy itself, but it is a necessary, absolutely vital part for our metabolism to occur, for us to have enough energy to be able to do anything in our life, or for us to be alive in the first place. So it's really interesting to see this change from ethanol, which would be in general be considered a poison, and then be shuttled to acetaldehyde, which is extremely destructive, and then immediately get changed into something that's extremely positive, something that's very good for our system. Or, well, I won't really say that it's very good necessarily. It's just within the context of these 3 molecules, acetate is by far the most beneficial and certainly very helpful. Now, and this is where we get the calories that we do from alcohol. Not only that, but again, I already mentioned that the TCA cycle, or citric acid cycle, indirectly offers energy through NAD and FAD, which then go through, again, not going to bog you down with the details, but it goes through a process in the electron transport chain, and then we actually get energy. We actually get calories, for a lack of better words, from that system. So this introduction of acetate, even if it's from alcohol, ends up as acetyl-CoA, and then we go through this process, this rotation. And during this process and through this rotation, we actually end up, and that's why I'm switching over here, we end up with CO2, and we actually also end up with water. And that is the metabolism of alcohol. Can you believe it? This is where we get our calories from. This is where indirectly we get our calories from, but we also need calories or energy to create ATP, and that's where acetate also ends up using some of that energy. So I find this really fascinating. Hopefully you did too. And those are the 3 steps broken down so you can understand exactly what's happening inside your body every time that you drink alcohol, that metabolism of that ethanol alcohol. Hopefully you found it informative. See you in the next section. How quickly is alcohol metabolized? Now, I really wish that I could give you a set number for this, but because we know that there's so many different factors that impact absorption alone, then we talk about metabolism and all the different functions that are involved in metabolism, and then we combine those two, and you're going to end up with a whole bunch of different factors that you have to control for to figure out an exact amount, or even like a relative range. It's going to be highly dependent on the individual. That said, however, there are some factors that you can take into consideration. For example, if you are an alcoholic, in that case, then of course that's going to impact your absorption, and it's going to impact, well, more specifically, your metabolism. Also, if you've got drugs in your system already, then we know that that microsomal system that's found in the endoplasmic reticulum is also impacted by the drugs. It also has a metabolic effect on drugs in general, so it's not just alcohol. So that being the case, if you already have drugs in your system, or you introduce drugs as you're metabolizing alcohol, that's also going to impede your ability to metabolize alcohol, which makes sense. And of course that's the true for the opposite as well. It's going to impede your ability to metabolize those drugs. And the final thing that I wanted to quick mention, there are of course more, again, linked in the article, but the last thing is how quickly you consume alcohol. So if you consume a whole lot of alcohol, of course it's going to take a long time to metabolize all that alcohol out of your system. Okay? All right. This is the summary of the video for those of you that need a quick recap. If not, please subscribe and check out the attached article. Okay. You're going to have to bear with me. You are going to get just the most rudimentary version of the entire video, and especially the article, which is even more detailed. It's going to be tough, but I'm going to try and give you some information. Alright, we're talking about alcohol, but specifically we're talking about ethanol, so we're not talking about any of the other types of alcohol like methanol, for example. And it gets digested and absorbed, specifically absorbed by the stomach and the intestines. The majority of it is absorbed in the intestines, and we go through a little bit of metabolism actually in the stomach already. So then once the alcohol enters the bloodstream, and it goes to primarily the liver, and in the liver cells, in the cytosol of those liver cells, then we start seeing that metabolism. So about 90% of metabolism, alcohol metabolism, occurs in the liver cells. However, some of that metabolism can also occur in the brain, pancreas, stomach, and then, of course, the liver. Now, once it's inside the cell and it's actually being metabolized, there are 3 different pathways by which alcohol is metabolized. However, the most known pathway and the most prevalent pathway is the alcohol dehydrogenase pathway. Not going to bog you down with those details right now, but if you are a heavy drinker, then some of the other 2 pathways, specifically one, the MEOS system or pathway, becomes far more active. And that's not necessarily a good thing, it's just kind of something that happens. And finally, I want to talk about how quickly we're able to absorb alcohol and metabolize alcohol. So the absorption of alcohol is highly dependent on how quickly you consume it. If you've eaten food, your gender certainly matters quite a bit as well, because if you are a woman, you tend to have lower levels of alcohol dehydrogenase, so that's going to impact the metabolic aspect of alcohol absorption and metabolism. Then, of course, if you're a long-term drinker, if you've consumed a bunch of drugs with the alcohol, that's also going to be tied up in that MEOS system. So that's going to degrade your ability to get rid or metabolize that alcohol. So a bunch of different factors, and there are far more factors than I mentioned here, or even in the major part of the video. You'd have to check those out in the article. So that's it. That's all I really wanted to go over. And I hope that this video is informative. I hope that you learned something. I would really be surprised if you didn't. I certainly learned quite a bit from all the research that I looked at. And if you did find something useful, informational, share the video. Like the video, at least I would really appreciate if you like the video. And subscribe if you want to see more physiology, exercise physiology, all kinds of physiology, medicine, like anything that's related to the body. That's what I cover on this channel. Nutrition, that's also covered on this channel. And I will be continuing to release these videos. So subscribe, like, share the video, and I will see you in the next video. Have a good day. See ya.